What will the year 2022 bring to young earth creationism? Yeah, I'm not here to talk about last year. I'm here to look forward to the challenges that are presented to young earth creationism in the coming year. I want to talk about an important new young earth creationist movie that is supposed to come out. What can we learn from an ICR logo change that just took place? And that and several other predictions I have about the state of creationism in 2022. So you might be wondering, who is this Joel Duff who thinks he can talk about creationism and predict the future of creationism in 2022? I can't predict the future, but I do know enough about creationism to, I think, make some intelligent guesses about the direction that creationism is trending. And I can say that because I've been a follower of young earth creationism for some 25 years. I'm a scientist and a Christian, right? I live in the world of science, doing science myself, but I'm also a devout Christian, and I have an interest in understanding God's creation and understanding how we understand this physical world of creation within the context of the first chapters of Genesis. And of course, young earth creationism is an attempt to understand those two things as well. But they happen to understand it as the Bible demanding an understanding of Earth's history as only being 6,000 years or less, and then finding evidence in the world around us to support that particular interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. And I'll say also I've contributed a couple chapters to a book that's in the Grand Canyon bookstore. Here I am in the Grand Canyon bookstore holding that book, Monument to an Ancient Earth, and written numerous articles. And I have a series called This Week in Creationism, which I've been doing for the last 6 months on this YouTube channel, in which I review headlines from creationism each week. And so that keeps me very familiar with the world of creationists. And even if, like I said, I know a lot of creationists and I talk a lot to young earth creationists, but I also read a tremendous amount of their literature. All right, with that said, let's dig into young earth creationism, although I do need to identify two different parts of what I'm going to talk about. Some of this is about the science, because I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges that creationists are facing in this coming year. And they're not really different challenges than they faced in the past, but I'm going to say that they're becoming more critical challenges as we move on. And those challenges have to do specifically with scientific questions. How can young earth creationists understand particular parts of this creation within the context of 6,000 years, and in particular within the context of a what they say is a global flood, which accounts for most of the geological features of this world. And so there's the creation science side of things, which is just sort of, let's look at the science, let's look at the evidence. How do we interpret their evidence? Maybe how do we interpret the evidence in light of scriptures? And then there's sort of the young earth creationism, all right, as a movement. And I'll say it's as a sociological, religious, political movement. The involvement of creationists in broader issues beyond just how do we understand, how do we provide answers to scientific questions, like when did the dinosaurs live, right? And creationism takes on much more than just, hey, we're here to answer scientific questions for people in church pews. Many creationists go well beyond that in the types of answers that they try to provide the Christian community. And that then gives them a different flavor. And so I want to speak to what is happening in creationism from that perspective, while at the same time asking questions about the specific scientific questions that they are grappling with right now. So I'll be kind of doing both of those things at the same time in this looking forward to 2022. So as I said before, we're going to look at challenges facing creation in 22, and then I want to point out some things to watch, and I'm going to make some predictions about what I think we're going to see in the year 2022. And I'm going to start it right out with what I think will be the most important development within creationism in the year 2022, assuming that this particular film is released in 2022. But as it says here, all right, let me go back just a moment. 5 years ago, there was a film called, a documentary film called Is Genesis History? That was released on a particular date to major theaters. It had a very large impact. And then, it's on video on demand. It's been seen millions of times. It's a very popular, broad, big overview of the question, well, is Genesis history? And is Genesis history specifically the history that young earth creationists think that history is, which is a history of a young world? And so it's full of scientific evidences that purport to support this young world of the Bible, along with some of the theological reasons why Christians should accept that this particular history is the history that Genesis is reporting. All right, I said at the time when I wrote a review that I thought that was a very significant event in young earth creationist history for a variety of reasons. I'm not going to rehash all those. I'll put a link below this talk to my review of that particular film. But this past year, it was announced that there's going to be a sequel to Is Genesis History? So here's Thomas Purefoy, who was the producer, writer, and director of Is Genesis History, and I presume will wear all three hats in this next film as well. He says they're in the process of producing a sequel to Is Genesis History. If all goes planned, we'll release it in late summer or fall of 2022, a little more than 5 years after our first film. We're calling it Mountains After the Flood, and that explores a question that he's had for a long time, which is, what did the world look like when Noah stepped off the ark? Now, I think this is a really great question because I've been asking this question of creationists quite a bit. If you're a follower at all of my blog and my recent YouTube channel videos, this is a really important question. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this is portrayed on the big screen, because this will be seen by a lot of young earth creationists or professing young earth creationists and those who they want to convince to be young earth creationists. And it will, in a way, become the default sort of vision or view that people have in their minds of what that world looked like when Noah on Mount Ararat stepped off and looked at essentially this new world, right? This world in front of him that had been completely destroyed, and then now needs to be refilled and repopulated with the animals that Noah had preserved. What did that world look like, and how much has that world changed since that moment that the flood was over or done with? That's a really critical question for creationists, and I'm going to say it's like the number one biggest challenge to young earth creationists. It has been for many, many years. And the very fact that Thomas Purefoy is going to take this on, I think is a huge challenge, because if you ask 20 different young earth creationist experts to talk about the issues having to do with the post-flood world, you're going to get 20 different answers as to what they think that post-world flood looked like and how it operated. And like I said, how is he going to pull this together and present it on film? One of the things that the original Is Genesis History... let me step back just a second. I feel like this film is going to be so challenging to pull together, and it could be this is the reason why it's already delayed. I have this screenshot from 6 months ago. And this is when that initial blog post came out on Is Genesis History, their website. And here is the exact same words. They didn't actually put out a new blog post. They simply went in and changed the old one, changed the text. Because here's the same text, but it says, if all goes as planned, we'll release this in February of 2022. Well, that's only 1 month away. But now, I'm not sure when they changed that, but sometime in the last couple of months, it looks like they've changed that to the fall of 2022. I won't be surprised at all if this doesn't make it in the year 2022. And part of that could be COVID, right? I mean, it could be COVID backup. the inability to shoot at different locations or get people together. But I also think that this film is particularly difficult to script in terms of the message. And I'll show you why in just a moment. I think, the basic gist of it is getting 5 or 6 or 7, if they do it in the form that the original film was done in, they're going to do it with multiple different creation science sort of experts that they bring together and talk about different topics. I think he's going to have a tough time sort of gelling that together so that they're all saying the same thing. And, I know he doesn't want to do it just as like, these are all different hypotheses. He wants to present like, here's the best vision we have, but I'm not sure there's a best vision when there's so much controversy with these topics. And so he could be running into a problem with this so controversial. Who am I going to represent from the creationist? And this is part of my theme in this, what's going on in 2022. And the reason I'm starting here is because there's a lot of disagreement among young earth creationists as they begin to try to flesh out their ideas. So they're not just, Whitcomb and Morris sort of like really vague things from the 1960s about like this flood and it could have done this and the mountains could have rose. And, it's like a lot of waving your hands around and like these things could have happened this way. Now young earth creationists are in the position where they have to actually try to like explain literally what happened and how we can actually see it in the evidence. And as they do so, they find it more and more difficult to have specific hypotheses that they can all agree to. And that's why I think this film, if it makes it to the screen this year, will be very important because it's going to have influence. And so whatever Purifoy and whoever is helping him sculpt this decide is the way we should present how to understand the scientific, the physical evidence of the world within this biblical context, however they decide to describe it, that's going to become a powerful narrative going forward in years to come that all other creationists and creationist organizations are going to have to deal with. Right? And so, here's the cover image potentially for that movie. So, it's the idea of where did the mountains we see today come from? How were they sculpted? They weren't all sculpted by the flood itself. Most people think they were sculpted by post-flood effects. And then that's what raises the questions. Well, then what did that world look like in terms of how chaotic was it, in terms of how it could have produced more geological features than just the flood itself? But let's get right to the list. I think this is worth spending a little time on right here because this will be the central portion of the criticism or the critique of where things are going in 2022 with respect to the scientific questions. And then we'll start hitting some of the sociological, religious movement sort of issues with creationism. So this is Purifoy writing to tell his audience, hey, we've got another film coming up. We're working on it right now. And here's how he presents it. It's an extremely challenging period to understand, the post-flood world. The questions are difficult to untangle and sometimes so obscure that most people aren't even aware of them. Now, another reason why I think this is going to be an important film is the average person, the average Christian, reading their Bible, thinking through these things, probably has never even thought of the problems he's going to list here, right? And when they see it on film, he's going to present issues about what that post-flood world looks like that most people would have never have thought about. And then when you start thinking about it, if it's not crystal clear, it actually has the chance of introducing doubt into people's minds rather than confirming their view. But sometimes when you get down into the nitty-gritty and the specifics, things become less clear than they were when you just had sort of a vague understanding or not even knowing that you had questions. And yet what he's doing here is he's bringing up the questions. And these are questions that I know of, and I know that all creation science academics, let's say, the ones that really study creation science, they're fully aware of these issues. But I'm saying that's an elite group. And Purefoy is going to try to bring these sort of elite squabbles in young earth creationism, try to synthesize them, and then present this to a very general public. To make things more difficult, very few creation scientists have been able to focus on them. Right? There's only a few creation scientists who even dare pick up these questions and try to answer them, right? Because they're difficult. As a result, there are still major disagreements about how questions should be answered. The short list includes, and this is a short list, but it's a very significant list. Where is the flood, post-flood boundary? Well, he goes right to the number one. And if you've read my blog, if you have watched any of my other recent videos, you know that I've been harping on the flood, post-flood boundary, and also the flood, pre-flood boundary. In a nutshell, that is, if there was a worldwide flood and it was initiated, right, at some point, the Bible talks about, and the flood waters, the flood, the deeps broke open, right? And the heavens released the water. All right, there's a moment in time where the flood begins. And one would think that such a dramatic event should be recorded somewhere in the geological column, the sediment layers below us. And then there's a time in which the flood finished, right? Or at least subsided enough that the land became apparent, that Noah's Ark was able to land, and eventually the animals disembark, and then they had a place to go, right? A place to go that wasn't absolutely chaos, and then they could survive in. Right? It had to be a few plants around for the animals to eat and so forth. Right? And then after that, a whole bunch of things must have happened. But we should be able to find that boundary, because there's a big difference between a massive global flood and then other things that have happened. Creation scientists argue about this a lot. There's no consensus among young earth creationists as to when they look at the rocks. They can't point to you and go, right there, those are post-flood rocks, and right there, those are flood rocks. Many of them can point to rocks and tell you that, but the next creationist you ask will point to the same rocks and pick out different rocks. So that is a significant issue, and go watch my video on the flood, pre-flood boundary, and post-flood boundary, and I explain why, depending on where you pick that boundary, you then alter how you answer a whole bunch of other questions, which are actually most of the other questions that are right here. And so it's a critical question. And I don't think that in this movie they're going to be able to say, we don't know. I think that they're going to go with the primary consensus view, which would be the one of answers in Genesis. And so I'll be fascinated to see if they take the answers in Genesis route, which is going to put in much more pressure on other groups who disagree with them. What form the enormous layers of sediment found on top of flood layers around the world? Notice that? I think the naive creationist who doesn't know the young earth creationist literature might think, as they look around and they believe that the world is only 6,000 years old, that all the sediments they're seeing are essentially formed by a flood. But in fact, some young earth creationists believe that a large segment, hundreds of feet, sometimes 1,000 feet of sediment on the top, is not from the flood, but it's actually from things that happened after the flood, the ice age and other chaotic events and large floods that happened, local floods that happened after a global flood. And this is a giveaway, actually, this line. I mean, the fact that he's saying large, enormous layers of sediment are found on top of flood layers, he's already given away what his position is, which is not the Institute for Creation Research position, it's the Answers in Genesis position. The Answers in Genesis position is that the flood layer ends about at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, which is where the dinosaurs end up. There's no more dinosaurs above that level, right? That's where they die off. And Institute for Creation Science puts the flood boundary way higher, like just very, very recently in the geological column. Those are diametrically opposed views, which have tremendous consequences for other views that creationists hold. And it looks to me like this film is going to take the Answers in Genesis, or I guess we could say the Andrew Snelling position on the flood boundary. How and when did land and air animals spread across the earth? Yes, that's a perennial question for creationists. They've been asked that question 10,000 times over the past 50 years. And still there's a lot of questions about that. No really satisfying answers to those questions. Will there be satisfying questions in this movie? I think it's going to be a rehash of all the past stuff, but it's an important question. How much and how quickly did different kinds of living creatures change after leaving the ark? Now there's the I would say the second big question. If I were to sum up all of young earth creationism and what are the two big questions that they need to answer, they need to have realistic answers for if anyone's going to take them seriously at all. They have to be able to explain how in the world a flood could preserve the fossil record that we observe, but they need to be able to identify that post-flood flood boundary so that they can use that to explain a bunch of other things. And the other thing is they need to be explain where did biological diversity come from after the flood and how much biological diversity evolved after the flood. And so maybe they'll bring in Nathaniel Jeanson for this particular part of the video. Answers in Genesis was pretty much cut out of the last film except for a piece by Andrew Snelling. Will Answers in Genesis play a larger role in this next film, or will the producer go with a bunch of independent creationists sort of cobbling together people on the periphery that aren't part of the main creation science organizations? I'm pretty sure Institute for Creation Research is going to be the odd man out because their views are not in line with the views that are expressed here. So this question is, how did animals change after getting off the ark, and how much did they change? That is a huge question for creationists that they're grappling with right now. And again, ask 10 different creationists, and you'll get 10 kind of different answers for how much change did they allow. With Institutes for Creation Research now coming on the not as much change, and Answers in Genesis, enormous amounts of change, evolutionary change or adaptation can occur after the flood. Then, of course, you've got like where do all the humans fit in? So you're going to have to deal with the human fossil record. And again, creationists don't agree on that either. And how do you correlate radioisotopes like carbon-14, which creationists, in my last video, talked about how creationists are all for carbon dating for things that are 3,000 years old because they support the biblical archaeology. But then when a carbon date says something is 6,000 years old, it must be wrong. So there's an interesting creation science question, right? If carbon-14 dating is accurate for a while and we can understand why it happens, like here's how carbon-14 is made in the atmosphere, here's how it decays, and I can measure that and I can get a result that's reliable and faithful, and I have evidence that it's reliable for several thousand years. What makes it become unreliable? Can I find evidence for that unreliability at some stages in the history of the earth and not others? And they need an adequate explanation for that as well. That's another missing link. And then what kind of post-flood catastrophes and forces shaped the different landscapes we see today? Mountains and valleys being shaped and sculpted after the flood, and how could those catastrophes have happened that aren't part of the flood? All right, you see, this is a group of this is a group of questions that have been asked essentially for the last 40 years in young earth creationism, none of which are fully answered at all. I mean, there's answers for all of them. Creationists have an answer for everything. But are they compelling answers? They're not compelling answers. And the reason I can say they're not compelling answers is because they haven't compelled the other creationists to believe these. Creationists will write about how another creationist is completely wrong on any one of these topics. And so it apparently isn't apparent, what the answer is. And coming to a consensus is going to be critical. So I will say that for the year 2022, what's going to be put on display in this video is going to be maybe one particular view of all these particular questions. And sometimes they might show 2 or 3 different views and say we don't know. But nonetheless, it's kind of bringing to a general audience these really difficult topics. And then we're going to see whether young earth creationists can kind of like get around this and say like, yes, let's come to agreement. We now have consensus. Or are we going to find that there's going to be people who are going to be upset about the direction that this particular film takes? And then down here, in this last part, I left this in here. Everyone assumes that the world we look at now is basically the world that Noah saw when getting off the ark. Yeah, I think that is the general assumption. I think, well, in most books, storybooks about early biblical times, they show the Noah's Ark and maybe show some mountains that don't have much vegetation on them. But essentially, most people think that Noah walked off and there was the Dead Sea and there was, the land of Israel, and it just needed to have a few more plants grow on it, and it would be just like it is today. I think he's exactly right. He's saying, but that can't be the case. It's a radically different world than most Christians think if young earth creationists and their world flood is a accurate portrayal of the biblical text. The damage caused by a flood would have created post-apocalyptic landscapes. Imagine a world without mature forest, with widespread plant life, with huge captured bodies of water, masses of broken trees and vegetation, dead animals, and endless vistas of earth and mud. That's going to be an interesting portrait put on a screen, is this post-flood world, and then how that world became this world, how the organisms survived and adapted in that world, and how that relates to this world. All right, spent a lot of time on that, but that kind of, that his discussion of what he hopes to portray in that film is the perfect set of questions that are like perennial questions that face young earth creationism all the time and will continue to face them in 2022, but I think are going to get highlighted in a way that's going to bring them more scrutiny is going to be brought to those particular questions. So first prediction here, consensus on answers to scientific questions will become even more elusive in the coming year. Now, I suggested that maybe the film will cause creationists to have greater consensus on answers to these scientific questions. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. Not knowing the characters involved, not having followed not having followed the arguments that they have made, why each one of another person's view is wrong. I think there's simply going to be more divisions occurring on these answers to scientific questions. So the divisions between the largest young earth apologetics groups, I think are going to continue to grow. Now, when I say continue to grow, I'm suggesting that there are divisions between apologetics ministries. So you have Institutes for Creation Research, you have Answers in Genesis, you have Creation Ministries International. Those are your three like big young earth creationist ministries, apologetics ministries. They're outreach organizations that are trying to promote young earth creationism. You also have Is Genesis History, which I've also talked about as a film, but it's also a website, and it also has a growing, I guess, following, and they have a different audience because they're part of what I've called the New Creationist, which is sort of a new way of approaching how to promote young earth creationism, the attitude in which they do so. Their form of apologetic, I think, is a little bit different. And they also have different scientific answers to these questions. So really you end up with sort of four groups sort of individuals. And let me try to illustrate some of those divisions and why I think the divisions will grow. Right? So I have a prediction, but it's not based on nothing. It's based on my past observations and the directions I see things going here in this next year. So to do that, let's go to Institute for Creation Research, and they had an article a couple days ago, New Year, New Logo. And so they've had this logo, which has the little yellow circles going around the ICR, which kind of represent sort of like an atom, right? And those are the orbitals with the electrons going around. The idea of, hey, they were really big into, a lot of their research involved radiometric dating. And so various forms of atoms, right? And so that kind of fit their overall research direction. And their emphasis from the very beginning was, well, it's an institute for creation research, understanding and investigating the world from a scientific, right, naturalistic perspective, except that they have a perspective of the Bible as giving them the overall history of the earth. And now they're trying to figure out, how can we understand the evidence of the world we see within the context of only having 6,000 years? And so, of course, they were dealing with radiometric dating all the time, because radiometric dating suggests something much more than 6,000 years. So they had to figure out how to understand that data within 6,000 years. Well, they've really moved on from that. That's kind of not their focal point at all anymore. They've become more biologically oriented. And one of the reasons they become more biologically oriented is because they do have a new president this past year. And that president is Randy Gugliuzza, who is a biologist by training. And his focal point is on that question that Purifoy had, which is, how did biological diversity arise after the flood? How did we go from God creating a kind, preserving it on the ark, and then how did biological diversity adapt to this post-flood world, right? Which in the young earth creationist mind is radically different than the original world that God created, or even radically different than the world between the fall or creation and the flood. And so how and why did animals take on the shapes that they have today and plants take on the shapes they have today? And so they've created a new logo that reflects their new emphasis. So I have to say here, after 52 years of fruitful ministry, we're renewing our commitment to rigorous scientific research that affirms the truth of Scripture. I've talked in the past about how the Institute for Creation Research is really, it is still the one organization that probably would say their main emphasis is still research, trying to understand the science of it. Whereas institutes for Answers in Genesis, sure, they have a couple people there that kind of do research on the side, but they're not a research operation. They're not really a creation science operation. They're an outreach. They're an apologetics ministry in which they are preaching what they believe is the truth, and they're taking all the information from other creation science research that others are doing, using that in their literature. Right? We're still the ICR you know, love, and support. All right? We seek to honor the Lord Jesus Christ as our Creator, Savior, and returning King. Now, what's the inspiration for ICR's new logo change? ICR's most pressing assignment is to fundamentally change the way people understand biology. Our task is to construct a completely new theory of biological design that incorporates recent discoveries and respects the biblical narrative. Now, this is a big vision, right? Completely construct a completely new theory of biological design. And he's not exaggerating here. I mean, Randy Gugliuzza really believes that a fundamentally new theory of biology, or of explanation for biology, adaptation and design, or appearance, morphology, is needed. And he doesn't just mean we need to replace evolutionary biology. He actually means we need to replace other creationist views of where the origins of biological design and diversity are. That theory, the theory, would explain hundreds of fascinating examples of creatures' abilities from an organism-centered, engineered-based perspective that gives God glory to their creator and not to nature. Gugliuzza also has an affinity for engineering. There's a couple other members of Institutes for Creation Research which are engineered-focused. And Randy Gugliuzza has really pushed this idea that is, I think, his brainchild, of what he calls CET, which is continuous environmental tracking. This isn't the place to explain the nuances of CET, but I guess in a nutshell, say it's it's a really different paradigm for understanding how organisms adapt. And what he's trying to get away from is saying anything about natural selection. He doesn't believe natural selection is a real force. He believes that organisms sense their environment and then they change themselves to adapt to that particular environment based on programming that they already have, right? That God has given them this capacity to continuously track the environment and then adapt to it. And he thinks this is something wholly different than other naturalistic explanations that include natural selection, which Answers in Genesis is fine with the concept of natural selection. So here he says, we hope this theory will become the fundamental design-based principle using biological explanations in Christian textbooks and museums, educating future generations of young believers. We pray that the engineering-based approach to biology will spark a second creationist revival. All right, so this is big forward thinking, a creationist revival. In other words, the creationism we understand today with respect to our understanding of biology and biological origins needs a revival. Anyway, he's essentially saying it's wrong. We've taken up and we have absorbed too much evolutionary biology. He's going to say that we've become evolutionary biologists in a way, speaking generally of young earth creationists. And we need to really get away from that and go with this engineering-based approach. And once again, stir up a sense of certainty in Christian truth. In other words, this is very murky ground we've been on, and we're not really providing a truly different way to understand biology. We've taken on too much evolutionary biology, and therefore we've mixed this world, which he equates with atheism, with Christianity, and therefore we can't really give Christians a sense of certainty the way we're going right now. All right, now you see that here's Institute for Creation Research. They've changed their logo. They've expressed the fact that they're really about biological research now. They're going to do a little bit of earth science, but they're biology now. And they have a vision that includes an entirely different form of theory for explaining biological origins, separating themselves from Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, definitely from Is Genesis History, which is not going to take this particular position at all. So they've set themselves out on an island. And it will be interesting to see if they can gain any traction. Thus far, I don't see any evidence that they've gained any traction at all. They certainly haven't convinced any of their colleagues. They've probably convinced some of their followers. But what they have to do is convince their colleagues for this to be a long-term success. So I'm going to take this a little farther. In that same article, I think we can see a nice contrast and see what's going to happen in the coming year. ICR's mission statement now. So they've kind of reformulated their mission statement. ICR supports to support the local church through. How are they going to support churches? Glorify Christ Jesus by emphasizing in all ICR resources the credit he is due as creator. Okay, great. Christ is the creator, and he does deserve credit for everything in the world that we see around us. But second, oppose the deification of nature by opposing Darwinian selectionism as an idolatrous worldview. This is a direct shot at Answers in Genesis. Nathaniel Jeanson, and even Jason Liesel, who used to work and be actually in charge of, I believe he was the head of their research department at ICR just a few years ago. He left to start his own ministry, the Bible Science Institute. He's much more apologetics focused now as well. And Liesel wrote in combination with Nathaniel Jeanson about Guglielmo and others at ICR, their complete misunderstanding of natural selection and how natural selection as a natural force is not evil in itself, and that Guglielmo doesn't understand it. But so here they are doubling down, in their maybe this is actually tripling down, I think. So here in their mission statement for this new year, oppose the deification, right? That other creationists are deifying nature. They're going to oppose that by opposing Darwinian selectionism. Yeah, like I said, they're putting themselves out there as being very different. Help pastors feed and defend their flock by providing scientific responses to secular attacks on the authority and authenticity of God's word. I mean, that's a general statement I think all the young earth creationist organizations say. And then change Christians' views of biology by constructing an organism-focused theory of biological design that highlights Jesus' work as creator. Now, I think all the other creationists are going to say, yes, Jesus is the creator. And this is where the continuous environmental tracking thing comes in. Yeah, how the evangelical defend the gospel as showing how natural processes cannot explain miracles in the Bible. Okay, I think they're all object to that too. What happens is they kind of take that and they end up rejecting other natural processes for other things that occur in the world that I think other creationists think is fine, right? Answers in Genesis is fine with populations changing over time and individuals being selected by a process called natural selection, and treating natural selection as a type of force, not a mystical force, but a process, just like gravity is a process, and not denying that process isn't an active process that God uses in shaping and adapting organisms in the environment. All right, so ICR is getting pretty far out there and has really staked off new territory. And I'm going to even emphasize that more. I'll go back to an article written by Jake Hebert from ICR, written in 2020. And here he's responding to what he's actually labeling as young earth evolutionists, right? He's actually labeling other creationists, particularly those that are involved with Is Genesis History, but a little bit for Answers in Genesis. Getting all my acronyms mixed up here. Let me read this to you. Young earth evolutionists uncritically accept the claim that evolutionists have many fossils that are good candidates for missing links. They also claim the earth is young but looks old. Right? That's the some creationists are going with the appearance of age thing, mixing that in a little bit. ICR has addressed this fallacious claim elsewhere. Not too surprisingly, evolutionists and bitter opponents of biblical Christianity, Richard Dawkins, has given one young earth evolutionist qualified praise for being an honest creationist. Right? You wouldn't want an atheist calling somebody an honest creationist who you disagree with, right? So if we go on in that same article, one notices a pattern. Young earth evolutionists tend to play up supposed evidence for evolution while playing down evidence for creation. All right, this is their perception, that other creationists and other organizations are playing up the evidence for evolution, sort of cozying up to it, incorporating aspects of evolutionary theory, which they do. They certainly do. And I've talked about that a lot, while playing down evidence for creation. And what he means by creation there is special creation, that God, specifically and supernaturally did things at particular times. Is this because the evidence is truly equivocal? Is it because they don't really see the evidence for the same kind of creation we do? And we creationists have been overstating our position? Or is it because young earth evolutionists are philosophically opposed even to the possibility that the evidence could strongly favor creation? He's doubting that other self-proclaimed young earth creationists really believe the young earth creationist position, that they're really trying to squeeze in a lot more time, even if it's just apparent time and not real time. And they want to squeeze in more naturalistic explanations for things in the world around us, hence their emphasis on we need to keep miracles, and we promise to keep miracles and not fall for the scientific explanations of this world. All right. What else can we say here? I'll make another prediction. All right, and now we're sort of stepping into more of this the sociological, religious movements, within the church, and how young earth creationism plays in that larger environment. I'll say that Answers in Genesis dominance as a ministry, it's going to continue through 2022 and 2023 and 2024 and 2025. And after that, all bets are off. But challenges to their leadership position, I think they're on the horizon. Answers in Genesis has been at the top of the heap for a while. And honestly, it's because of Ken Ham. I mean, he is a force of nature. He has a personality that he's the one big personality, I'll say, in creationism that simply draws attention. He's famous, right? And he's built himself into a famous character. Answers in Genesis doesn't have his name in it, but it is the ministry of Ken Ham. And as long as Ken Ham is active and engaged in that ministry, it's going to be hard to unseat that ministry. And dominance can mean a couple different things. I mean, dominance has several different aspects here. One is they dominate in terms of money raised, right? So there's thousands of evangelical churches out there that have professing members that are young earth creationists, and they see young earth creationism as an important way of sort of pushing back against a secular world, right? So supporting young earth creationism is one of the ways to say, yes, Genesis is foundational and we can't give up on that. We need to support this bottom-up approach of support these ministries that are supporting the authority of God's word. And a lot of donations are made. The vast majority of those go to Answers in Genesis. And so they have the most money. And when you have the most money, you can do the most things. They produce the largest volume of literature. That literature then reaches more hands in the general Christian community, and therefore more money comes back to them. It's just a really simple relationship in that fact. They can also send out more people to talk, and so more speaking engagements results in more donations. More donations leads to them being able to do bigger things like the Ark Encounter and the Answers, the Creation Museum, which then themselves advertise for themselves. Right? You can't unseat that kind of dominance as a ministry. Dominance also means whatever their view is of a particular topic. So this is why Institute for Creation Research is in a little bit of a pickle. Even if I were to say, look, their idea is better. Like, they're on better scientific grounds for where they place the post-flood boundary, which is really different than Answers in Genesis. Or maybe their idea of continuous environmental tracking truly is novel and maybe has a chance to be an important creation science contribution. But will it become one? Not as long as Ken Ham is saying it isn't. Right? Not as long as Ken Ham employs a couple people who are writing against that particular idea. It doesn't have much of a chance to get off the ground. As much as we'd like to say that the truth will win out, that's a long-term process. Right? So, and maybe ICR has a long-term vision. They may know this is a 20-year battle. But the other thing they know is Ken Ham's not getting younger. Right? Ken Ham's not getting younger. He's already backed away from some of the roles he's had in the past. I mean, he's not president anymore. I'm not sure if he's not CEO or president. One of those two roles he's no longer part of. He's more figurehead at Answers in Genesis. Sure, he's speaking a lot still. He's still writing a lot. He's ever present on social media. But that engagement, I expect, that's why I said 3-4 years from now, who knows, where Answers in Genesis is, because Answers in Genesis is Ken Ham. And, it's like a lot of ministers like Ravi Zacharias or look at Ligonier Ministries and R.C. Sproul, right? That's a big ministry. And ever since R.C. Sproul died, you know what? I can't even name who's in charge there or who does a lot of their writing. And I'm actually on their newsletter. You know, I get information from them. You know what I get from them? Old videos of R.C. Sproul speaking, right? They've had a number of speakers who've tried to kind of step in and take the role of, you know, that ministry. And I can't name any of those for you. Now, I'm not, obviously there are people who can. And so I'm not as involved with Ligonier as I probably should be. But, you know, that ministry was R.C. Sproul. And Answers in Genesis is Ken Ham. And there isn't anyone with his personality to step into his place. And so when he's no longer as active as he is today, that's going to allow an opportunity for all those other ministries to maybe get a larger piece of the pie in terms of donations. And I think more importantly, to have more influence in terms of ideas. Because basically if Ken Ham says, well, this is the view, this is the creation science view, well, then it is by default the creation science view. Even if there are 10 different opinions and there are better hypotheses, better theories, once he decides this is the best view, there's no moving that. That will be the Answers in Genesis position on that particular topic. And then it will end up in a display in the Creation Museum, and it'll be hanging on the wall in the Ark Encounter and so forth. And that has a huge amount of influence. That influence will continue for a long time. So it'll be a slow decline for Answers in Genesis. I don't see a major implosion that I know people that kind of hope for that, but that's not at all what I see happening. However, that position of leadership is on the rocks in the sense that I think is Genesis history is a growing group with greater influence. And, you know, the films that they're making, I don't know where it's going to end up, but they've made some high quality videos. And I think they're going to have a big influence in the future. So I think we're at a stage right now in 2020, which we're going to start seeing some changes. Now, let me go back because I need to explain a little bit about the origins of Answers in Genesis in order for you to maybe understand why the next coming years will be critical and why also there really is no love lost between the major creationist organizations. And so they're not going to rally to save one another. They're simply going to see it as their chance to become more important in this field and they're all doing God's work, right, in their minds. And so God is blessing them, if they see their organization grow. So I would go back to the split between Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International. It was all Answers in Genesis at one point, and then there was a Answers in Genesis in Australia. And that organization was started by Ken Ham long ago, along with a couple other people, including Carl Weiland. And in 2004, really big problems started to brew between that Australian organization, or I'll say the Australian section of Answers in Genesis, and the mainland USA version of Answers in Genesis based in Kentucky underneath Ken Ham. And that rift began in 2004 and eventually all the way up until 2009 when it became official. And there was an official split in that organization. And the one that lost out on the Answers in Genesis name then rebranded themselves as Creation Ministries International. And you can find their website at creation.com. And there was I went back and I was rereading some of the documents that were part of that split. Creation Ministries International actually published a huge amount of literature when they were in their dispute that eventually went to court, and then they settled out of court and with an agreement that they were neither going to talk about it. And so all that court documentation from the final decision of who got what in their dispute still isn't known. But if I go back and I look at something like the 2007 Breeze Report, which is something kind of commissioned by Creation Ministries International to kind of like investigate what happened and pull together documentation, which eventually would lead to their lawsuit against Answers in Genesis. And I'm just going to pick out a couple quotes because there's that I think reflects the organizational situation with Answers in Genesis and how Answers in Genesis is different than the other creationist organizations, which have a different organizational hierarchy. So these are quotes from a phone conversation in 2004 between Carl Weiland, who was overseeing the Australian section of Answers in Genesis and was longtime friends with Ken Ham way back when Ken Ham was in Australia. And so here he says, and we only have Ken Weiland's transcript from his recorded phone call. Ken, I have never seen anything more obvious, and I am not the only person in the world who thinks that the whole thing is heading in the direction of Ken Ham Ministries rather than Answers in Genesis. That's the bottom line. You asked me years ago to tell you when I thought you had a pride and ego problem, and I think now that time has come. It boils down to this is the nascent issue that started the crack that separated these two creationist organizations. Sure, there's other personalities involved. There are disagreements about how to proceed with initiatives like Ken Ham's having this idea about a creation museum, right? And well, actually, he's already fully developed later by the time this ends. And I suspect that there was disagreements on various boards and discussions about whether that was a wise use of their resources or not. And all of those can lead to conflict. I mean, this is just stuff that happens in large organizations, right? Large companies, which is essentially what Answers in Genesis has become. But at the bottom of it, it's the idea that Ken Ham consolidates power. It becomes a Ken Ham, I'm not going to call it a Ken Ham cult, but I'm going to say it's a cultic personality there where everything runs through him. And eventually everyone who's on the board or other people that would have had influence are essentially removed and put in with, and what are put in place are basically yes men, people who very much have the exact same vision of Ken Ham or that Ken Ham can influence their vision. So continuing, Ken, every one of our guys that's been over there has seen the culture. And I'm not talking about the U.S. culture. I'll tell you straight, all the guys that have been there at some level or other sense that there was a massively hierarchical, unhealthy corporate atmosphere. And it's gearing toward the big guy at the top. Every time one of our guys goes over there, and he's talking about, you have periodic meetings where we get together physically, the different, the Canadian group, the European, there's Answers in Genesis, different locations around the world. Every time one of our guys goes over there, there's people who sit down and pour their hearts out. And I'm talking junior people about how harassed they feel and how pressured and how unfair this is and that is. That's not a healthy, open atmosphere. Now, these same complaints continue through today. I mean, there are those that have been employees there that have left that have complained quite a bit about the repressive environment there. I'm sure there are people that love it there too, but you have to be fully invested in the mission exactly as Ken Ham sees it in order for you to feel fully invested and enjoy the job. It's very difficult to have any kind of open disagreement there about how to interpret evidence or information or what direction we should be going. And that's why I say that as long as Ken Ham's involved, he's going to steer the ship in a particular direction, and he has the force of presence to make it happen, right? He is a dominant leader in that sense. And there's the good sense of that. There's also the negative side, the negative sense of that. The negative part of that is that because it is Ken Ham Ministries, when Ken Ham is no longer involved, it becomes harder for them to maintain a particular identity and maintain a particular direction. And this is nothing new. This is what happens to all large corporations and companies. They find it very difficult to transition to the next next portion of their life, when their identity is wrapped up in a person. And this is definitely not true for Institute for Creation Research. Now, sure, they used to have Henry Morris, right? The original creation scientist, starting the Institute for Creation Research. And then you had Henry Morris's son take over after that. So they had this lineage there. But now they've moved to Randy Gugliuzza, and they don't really have anybody that's in that family of the Morrises that I know of that's still involved in Institute for Creation Research. So they have transitioned, and they've maintained essentially the same kind of vision over time. And so I actually feel a little bit bad for them because they spent all this money making their own creation museum down there in Texas, the ICR Discovery. Oh, I can't remember the name of it. It's had a couple different names because they had an original name that they changed. But that's a poor excuse for me not remembering what it is right now. Anyway, they got their own, I'll call it Creation Museum. And I don't know, I honestly, I completely lost interest in it after it opened. And I don't know anyone who's toured it. I don't know of any big reviews of it. It doesn't have the impact and the footprint that the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum has, and kind of for good reason. They don't have the resources to be able to really market it in the same way. And so beyond the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I'm not sure what influence it has there. I have no idea how many visitors they get and whether, how sustainable that particular museum is going to be. But they've gone through a lot of transitions. They've lost people. They've brought in a few new people. They really need some new blood there right now. And I don't know how they're going to get it because Answers in Genesis and other organizations have more money and more manpower to basically suck up anybody that's sort of a good apologist and believes in creation science. And I don't really see a younger generation. I just don't see the younger generation, grabbing onto their, ideas of biological diversity or their ideas for the flood boundary and all these important things that they disagree on with other creationists. It's not like they're winning over the young hearts. So in that way, they may be a little bit hard times could be upon them in the future because of the choices they're making right now. Or being individualistic eventually will win the day. I don't know. I'm not going to make any predictions on that one. All right, another prediction. Young Earth creation apologetics will become increasingly tied to Christian culture wars to maintain their impact within the church. I think that Young Earth Creationist ministries have an outsized influence on the overall Christian church. It's oversized compared to the size of those parachurch organizations. Sure, they have a lot of money. But it's not an enormous amount of money. But given the amount of money they have an enormous effect on the church. It's sort of a grassroots, they provide basic answers to fundamental questions about the way the world operates within the context of, hey, we're the ones that are the true believers in the church because we are the ones that believe in the true authority of God's word. And you can very simply, like a simple person, somebody in the church pew who doesn't understand Hebrew or Greek can just read their Bible and say, 6 days and a global flood. And they know the truth. And so you can trust this organization to provide you with the anti-culture message, right? That surrounds you, that tells you that you watch movies that tell you that the dinosaurs lived a long time ago and so forth. But it goes far beyond that. Because once you have the confidence that this organization is sort of like upholding the truth, and it's even teaching the church that not to trust the rest of the church, right? Oh, you see your pastor there. You see people in these seminaries, and they're teaching these other things that don't sound like real truth, right? They must be compromising the true authority of the word. And so don't trust them. And so by doing so, then, there's many other questions about life in this world and how to understand our Christian walk. There's so many other social issues. And where are you going to go to understand those social issues? Well, young Earth Creationists, specifically Answers in Genesis, and more specifically, Ken Ham, is willing to tell you exactly what you should believe about all those other cultural issues. Because they've already established for themselves that we're the true believers and you can trust us on this issue. So now here's the answers to all your other problems. And so that keeps the donors, the donations coming in. That keeps them coming back to the website. That keeps them being invited into churches where they talk not just about, hey, how to understand, the age of the earth. They're going to spend far more time on cultural issues and how we understand the culture war that we're in with the secular society. That's a powerful force, and that's what maintains the power of these organizations. And I would say that Answers in Genesis is the behemoth, but the others survive on this capital as well of culture wars. Ken Ham is always, that's what he's always been about anyway. I don't think he really cares a whole lot about scientific questions. I mean, to him, he's not intrigued by the world, the physical world, right? This is just a temporary place. Okay, we need some answers to how to respond to secular culture, but I'm not like intensely interested. He's not intensely interested himself in those particular questions. He's interested in how do we protect Christians against all these other aspects of society, and simply using science as sort of the gateway or the inroad to get people to listen to him is a way to advance his agenda for the church. And so he's very influential, and creation apologetics is very influential in the church. Even though a small, if you look over time, clearly young Earth creationism is on the wane. You might not think that if you were to listen to them and you see the growth of creation science over time, and that Ark encounter, and you got this museum and all these things, that looks like growth. And if you look at their bottom line, they are getting more donations than they ever had before. So that appears to be a growing movement. And yet when you do surveys and so forth, you'll find out that a smaller and smaller segment of society truly believe in a young Earth and the other components of young Earth creationism. And so in a way, Ken Ham and others kind of double down on the culture wars, because this is a way of that's their bread and butter, not the science questions. They're kind of losing on the science questions over time. So here's Ken Ham from just a couple days ago. This is sort of a kind of his typical response to things. Regardless of such research, we've seen millions of visitors come to the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. And he's talking about this Pew Research Center survey, which suggests that overall Christianity has dropped 12% in the past 20 years. And so there are fewer and fewer self-proclaimed Christians in our, what he would like to say should be a Christian society. But I think even Ken Ham would say we're not a Christian society anymore. We're a post-Christian country. So he points out that millions of visitors have come to the Ark Encounter and Creation Museum. Yeah, millions have come. It's true. Of whom the majority are Christians. Like Elijah, we need to be reminded God has his remnant, and it's bigger than we often think. So he's saying, okay, we're a remnant. He's kind of admitting here, Christianity is kind of a remnant now. And the real remnant are the real true believers, the ones that hold a high authority of Scripture, not lots of churches which don't. But he's also trying to say that, see, we have had millions of people come. We have this big influence, and people, maybe you don't know it, but there's actually millions of people that believe like we do. Now, lots of people go to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. I've got a big kind of go through the Ark Encounter video coming up. And one of the things I'm going to say there is lots of people come there and are entertained and generally feel like I'm going to a Christian environment, but they don't really understand what they're seeing there. They're not devoted young Earth creationists, and they might not be. They may very well walk out. They're a creation. They come in, they believe in the authority of God. They walk out, and they still don't have any idea what young Earth creationism is or requires them to believe. So I don't think just because millions come doesn't mean there's millions of devoted followers who truly understand the importance of this topic and really believe in a young Earth. But what he's suggesting here is that, we still have this remnant. Now, what I think is fascinating here is he admits the majority are Christians. Now, when creation science first started, the original mission of creation science organizations wasn't just to uphold and help churches stay faithful, like help members stay faithful and understand answers to scientific questions within the context of a 6,000-year-old. It was to convince the world that the earth was young, as an apologetic itself, as a means of convincing the rest of the world. Look, if you just looked at this evidence, you would be convinced that the world is young. And then you would look around and you'd say, look, all these people believe the world is billions of years old, but the evidence obviously points to a young earth. And if I go to the scriptures, that's the only word we have, it's the only text we have that clearly pronounces the world to be young, and therefore the evidence I have in front of my face matches with that. So I should really give consideration to those scriptures as being the true word of God. Having called the young earth, 6,000 years ago, called it out as being young, and it's been proven to be true. Right? So using young earth evidences as a means of convincing the non-believer that they should become believers. And what I've seen over the years is less emphasis on that and more just how to protect the believer, right? We don't want the believers falling away. How many books has Ken Ham written in the last few years about the church falling away, about believers falling away, and why? His explanation is always because we didn't take Genesis seriously. And once you don't take that seriously, you'll fall away from the church. So it's all about keeping your own. It's all about maintaining your enclave. If we can just give you enough evidence that you don't stray, and usually it's more like, here, let's give you some tidbits that help you understand the earth is young, and then let's tell you don't read anything else. It's like, stay away from that. That's bad. That's bad. That's bad. Don't read that person. Don't listen to seminary professors. Don't listen to your pastor if he doesn't say X, Y, and Z. And believe us and just read our literature. That's an exclusive, almost cultish like approach, right? It's like, protect our own. We're not really trying to convert anyone else. We're just trying to maintain ourselves through time. We're the remnant, and we're going to remain the remnant, faithful until the end, which I think for Ken Ham's mind is not very far away. And so it's sort of like, you got the world. And the culture wars are kind of similar to that. It's sort of like, leave us alone. We don't want to be part of this world. Yes, if we could transform it, that's great. But really, we're trying to maintain ourselves and not have our rights impinged upon. Well, so is 2022 going to bring a sunset upon young earth creationism? And I think you've gathered from what I've said that no, I don't think so. Young earth creationism is here for a long time. And by a long time, I mean hundreds of years. There's always going to be people that believe that the earth is young, because I think that particular interpretation of the scriptures is an attractive interpretation, because it's simple. It makes life simple, even though it makes it incredibly complex if you start asking a lot of questions. But if you're not going to ask a lot of questions, it's a very simple answer to the world's, the perceived secular world's problems. And it's like an identity card. It's like saying, I want to be different than the rest. We're told that Christians should be different than the rest of the world, and this is a way of really showing I'm different, right? I believe this Bible, which says the world is only 6,000 years old, and all of you don't. Right. And so you can feel really special by being a young earth creationist. So young earth creationism isn't going to die. Neither, though, do I think it's ever going to. I think it's reached its apex a few years back. There just isn't as much discussion of young earth creationism anymore. I know that because something like my blog receives less views than it did 5 years ago, even though I have more content. Now, there can be other reasons in terms of like people use cell phones more than computers and stuff like that. But this is a growing trend among many different places that kind of like get into these types of discussions, that there's less interest in these topics of young earth creationism. And there's a lot more discussion of evolutionary creationism, intelligent design, maybe not so much intelligent design, but definitely progressive creationism has much more discussed in the church. We've already seen an article in Fox News this week that talks about Adam and Eve from a perspective that's very different than I'm sure Ken Ham would want to be talked about. And multiple books that have come out that have been very popular, talking about Adam and Eve and within a more evolutionary creationist perspective. And Ken Ham definitely feels that pressure. I mean, he's getting more and more antsy about it, and young earth creationists are getting more and more hyper vigilant about calling these, basically the whole world of Christianity around them compromisers. And so it's becoming a smaller and smaller number. And young earth creationists haven't grown in terms of the number of actual scientists doing creation science. I would argue there's fewer than there were in the past. And so it is sort of falling in on itself, and despite that, they still can't kind of like all agree. You would think when they get to be smaller numbers, they would kind of come together, for sort of like help each other out. But I think we're going to see more divisions, because for one thing, you're going to be splitting a smaller piece of the pie. I think that donations will eventually go down. And when that happens and you have infrastructure that needs to be held up, then organizations have to be a little more aggressive in terms of how they raise funds. And then they're basically raising funds on the backs of taking away funds from other organizations. In the past, I think there's just been enough money to go around that they don't kind of have to fight with each other about it. So I think these are things that we're seeing shifting and changing in the past couple years. And I think we're going to see a little more dramatically happening here in 2020. So to summarize, the organizations are becoming more different from each other. They've each have their own special, they're each identifying themselves and willing to take on positions that are contrary to other organizations. And I don't know what that strategy is for. Is it just simply, this is what we believe and therefore we're going to push that? Or is there a more strategical sort of reason for that? And then again, like I said, I think this is Genesis History Part 2 will tell us a lot about where creationism is. Who is going to be willing to get together and be portrayed in that film? Are some of the organizations going to want their people on film saying certain things? Or are they going to say, I don't want you to be part of that project because there's these other people we disagree with on that project? I think the interpersonal interactions may play as big a role as just strictly the science or strictly our goals as Christians will play in the coming year in terms of shaping where creation science is in 2022 and beyond. With that, I will come to an end here. Thanks a lot if you're still with me, you've really hung in there. Either that or you just fast forward to the end. So thanks again. My name's Joel Duff, and you can find my writings, and I actually have year-end reviews from several other years if you want to compare what I said then with what I'm saying now at thenaturalhistorian.com. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for being here. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.